So, welcome back to the show. I'm just glad that you're doing this with us this Monday morning as we go into the week. I told you that in the second hour of the show, we'll be going into developments coming out of Parliament. And here we're joined by Matthew Parks. He's coming through from Cosatu. He's a parliamentary coordinator for Cosatu and coming through to speak to us about this Older Persons Amendment Bill. This bill has since been passed by members of Parliament. It's now going to the President for consideration, and the President will have to attach his signature so we can see this bill getting meaning on the ground. So this bill has now been sent to the President. Once implemented, this new legislation will allow for authorities to relocate an older person to temporary safe care without needing a court order. This is described as a long overdue intervention to prioritize the safety and dignity of the elderly and to also affirm their fundamental social rights. And this morning we're looking at this one with Cosatu. We hear that it's been a long time coming, right? It's been, there at Parliament and Parliament, members of Parliament trying to really, thresh it out as to the implications, taking it through various of these processes. But we hear that it's been long overdue, and we'd like to hear from you as well. What do you make of this one? Let's talk about this one. 0861987000, and there by X we go by at PowerFM 987 at Katlego Legodi _ So Matthew will help us go into this bill as well, what it means, the nitty-gritties here, as we see here that all eyes are now on President Cyril Ramaphosa to attach his signature. Matthew, good morning, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for giving us your time. I mean, really, when you look at it, a lot of people may not even be aware that there was such a bill here. But we hear that this is a bill that has gone through various of these processes to a point of being passed by members of Parliament and is going to the President for consideration. The Older Persons Amendment Bill. Let's break it down, Matthew. Maybe help us make sense of this bill. What is it all about? What does it say? And how do we find ourselves here?
Well, it's a fairly common sense. Actually, something that should have been done in a long time. But basically, in essence, it seeks to provide some level of protection and care, safety and security for the elderly. Especially the elderly who live in old age homes. So it seeks to provide some sort of norms and standards for old age homes, so some oversight and accountability by how the old age homes are run, some minimum level of care, and also quality of comfort for people who live there, and also make sure the people who run these old age homes are properly registered, they're qualified, they're held accountable by the relevant departments of social development, especially at provincial government level. And also that when abuses take place, that people are obliged to report them. Those people who they report them to are required in government to investigate, to make sure action is taken. If any elderly person's, safety or lives are in danger, they need to be put in places of care, not to be left where they are, where they might be vulnerable to further abuse. And also to kind of protect the assets, the inheritance, the money of any elderly people from being exploited or stolen, even by the relatives. It's a fairly common sense stuff you would assume was long there, but we have seen abuses taking place in the recent past in some old age homes, whether it's in Gauteng or in Cape Town. And people who are retired are often vulnerable, physically, mentally, and that they need to kind of be protected. So I think this bill just seeks to really make sure they put some safety mechanisms in that so that actually when they're at the most vulnerable in retirement, that indeed they have some protection being put in place to assure them of some dignity and comfort when they retire.
Yeah, so were there issues that maybe people picked up to say the elderly looked somewhat abandoned here? Is it a matter of someone that would blow the whistle to social department or social services to say there's an older lady here that is not being taken care of, and then we would see all of these processes having started and playing themselves out? Because we hear that what this bill is now bringing, for instance, it will, kill the all of these administrative issues that would play themselves out, including a court process that would have been needed before a person can move into this space. We see that now an older person can be moved into this temporary safe care without needing a court order, and this is something that was not the case in the past. Where do we see these issues emanating from, and do we then see this law, if it comes into law, then eliminating the element of the court process?
No, I mean, it's just to do exactly that. We have instances, in Cape Town, was old age home, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, I think in Bracken, if memory serves me right, where you had people who are running these old age homes who are not licensed, who are not registered, who are not qualified, trained in any sense of the word, who are not even being supervised or held accountable. So really seeks to kind of make sure that these institutions, that they have a level of oversight and transparency and accountability, that the departments can put in place minimum norms and standards. You saw in Gauteng the tragedy that took place about 5 or so years ago when many lives were lost amazingly because exactly of this. There was no minimum norms and standards put in place. So really seeks to kind of, okay, you have to have some sort of control and oversight by provincial government. You've got to have some sort of capacity and training to be put in place, and to hopefully prevent a recurrence of that kind of abuse. Also, laws about shifting the culture too, and so to make it more of a strategic objective of the department that we have to make sure that where these homes are set up, that the provincial government takes it upon itself to make sure they are being regulated, they are being supervised, and there's regular inspection of them. It can't just be a free-for-all. You have some of these institutions taking money from the state if they had no minimum norms and standards. So it really seeks to kind of prevent that kind of a recurrence. And hopefully, it'll send a signal that these homes have to take the safety of the elderly as a priority and not just some sort of nicety that they could think about if they want to.
So this would be a case then that would come from a Katlego, that is a neighbor to a gogo, that I see that this gogo is not going, is not doing well, and then I let the authorities know that there's an elderly person here that seems to be struggling here, and we see them now talking about defining even the role of police officers when there is such an incident that would play itself out. Am I imagining it right, that there would have to be someone that registers something, that blows the whistle here, and then that's when the authorities will be following through, but there would still be a process that would be adhered to here in terms of consent, in terms of the family availability and other alternatives before this elderly can then be moved. There has to be someone that is worried about the well-being of this elderly.
Yes, no, you got it exactly right. And the people who know about abuses are legally required to report it to someone in authority, and that person in authority has a legal obligation to then institute an investigation. And so those are critical. Again, it's stuff that we'd all assume was always there, but it's useful because if you are a social worker, if you're a medical official or something like that, or even somebody who just happened to be passing through and you don't report, you can be held accountable. And of course, if you're the person in the state of authority, you didn't do anything about it, again, you can be held legally accountable. So these are all critical, because if we just simply make these things voluntary, then how exactly will you hold people accountable? How exactly will you force a change and begin to signal to people that you have to take this thing seriously? So it's useful for the health officials. They know they have to take it seriously. They're useful for social development officials. They know this is a legal obligation upon them, and similarly for the police as well. It also sends a signal to Treasury as well that they have to begin to fund the support for the elderly in a dedicated, serious way.
Yeah.
Again, because you don't put money there, then often these things get forgotten. They fall by the wayside.
Yeah, just a reminder to our listeners at home that we're speaking to Cosatu this morning, joined by Matthew Parks, coming through from Parliament, giving us a sense of the work that is flowing from there, looking at this bill. Here we're looking at the elderly. It's called the Older Persons Amendment Bill. And this bill, we're told here, that is coming through to relax legislation that would pertain to the movement of the elderly, the relocation of the elderly to temporary safe care without needing somewhat of a court order. So this described as something that is long overdue. But we see this measure, Matthew, as something that would be temporary because they are calling this a temporary safe care. If this gogo is removed and we are worried about her well-being, how do we guarantee that, there is longevity to this decision that we are taking here instead of us acting like we are doing something and then a couple of years later the gogo is back in the community and in a far worse off of a condition here? Do we then have these facilities to house this elderly? I know you spoke about Treasury having to now rethink how it funds the elderly, but as we speak right now, as we're seeing a push for this bill to be implemented, do we see structures on the ground being worked? Do we see facilities that would take care of the elderly? Because the last time I checked, it was actually expensive to check in an elderly into some of these facilities. You'd find that it's only the privileged, the rich, the whites that would find themselves in some of these facilities as the elders, but the black gogos would be there in the communities and the struggle would be real for them. So how do we actually see this one playing out in a way that it does not then become a temporary safe care? It does have that long term, but at the same time, there are facilities to accommodate this plan.
Yeah. Look, I mean, this isn't going to be magic wand. It's not going to resolve the entire issue altogether, but it does begin to, nudge those who provide accommodation to take safety seriously, and does require the state, when there is danger and the threat and abuse, provide alternative accommodation. You're right. Most elderly will not live in old age homes. Many instances that's for the better because most elderly would live with their family, with relatives, which in most instances is a good thing, who can provide them 24-hour care. It's more comfortable and so on. But if there were people who do live in old age homes, then there needs to be some sort of safety for them. But, it's a difficult one because the state was also unlimited. But culture, I think most South Africans would prefer families to live with them, which is really what you want. But it's trying to provide a bit of a balance. But where people live in old age homes, then this is where largely where the bill comes into effect that say, okay, there has to be oversight and accountability. But even people who don't live in old age homes, who live with a family, the bill is still relevant. It deals with the issue of safety, that anybody who abuses them can be held accountable. Everybody knows that abusers must report it, and the law enforcement of the state needs to intervene, and that includes protecting their assets. So even those will still be relevant and applicable. Even people who don't live in all their homes, but live with their family as well. Those will still apply as well, still be relevant too.
And these then, the old age homes, which department? Because one suspects that as we see this bill becoming law, there now would be that need for somewhat of an interdepartmental process that would have to play itself out here. You've mentioned the Treasury as well, but we know social development. So as we speak right now, who then shoulders that responsibility around the elders? Who then is responsible to ensure that there are those old age homes? And how are we faring where that is concerned, Matthew? Because if we see some of these issues coming and playing themselves out, and others even saying that this intervention is long overdue, it does tell you that there has been somewhat of a gap in the system, in the space. So how are we faring where old age homes are concerned? Do we have them scattered across? Which department, is in charge here? Because at some point, one would even see the private ones being the ones that are more pronounced, but we don't get a sense of where do we then locate the old age homes that are endorsed by the department.
Yeah, well, the state ones would fall under the Department of Social Development, which is largely a provincial function, and they're run and they have to hold them accountable. But you're right, they're not anywhere near enough, and they tend to be located in the cities. You find many of them in historically or less disadvantaged. I don't want to say they're advantaged because most of them are not really that comfortable. But historically less disadvantaged communities. I know in Cape Town we've got quite a few. Often also areas which are, on the Cape Flats. I know there's quite a few in Atla and Noble Park, other places, Pinelands, you find in Rondebosch and so on. Often they're historically white communities, but they are there. But they fall under the Department of Social Development. But this law applies both to the public ones, which fall under social development, but also covers the private ones too. Often you find the real problems in the private ones where there's just no transparency, no oversight and accountability. And in many instances, people do a good job, but you have also some which really has just become an economic opportunity by the owner, and that's what corners end up being cut. And then again, you've got the elderly who are living there who are vulnerable from mental, from physical, from a health perspective, and that's why they need to have these measures in place. It is difficult for the state. The state has just got so many pressing demands. All of them are equally legitimate, all of them equally urgent, but has limited resources. But still, you have to have some sort of safety mechanism in place. You can't be cutting corners like this because there are real-life consequences to abuse, people can die, and so forth. But also, it's a necessary debate, as you're saying, to begin to say, if you want to have these things, how are we going to fund them? And I think it's a long overdue discussion. But again, it is good that most elderly live at home with a family, where they get 24/7 care. They can be more in comfort and so forth. But even then, you do have to have minimum norms of standards too. You do have to have some sort of safety mechanisms as well. So this also helped to nudge government to have more social workers, more community health workers who can actually go and help make sure the law is enforced. And also helps to nudge the police as well to know that this is also important, and they also need to prioritize this in their task as well.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And also, when you look at it, I mean, I'm just looking at the prices here. Most of them would be going for around 30,000 rand to 40,000 rand per month. And this would be for a full-time frail care. And you look at this and you think about even the grant that they're getting. It's not even close to being able to cover some of these spaces or facilities. Excuse me, Matthew. So not so many seniors can manage this sort of cost. Even if the children are willing to chip in here and they're able to chip in here, there are issues that would play themselves out, healthcare concerns that would come through as well, because you know very well that this is a person that is just frail, they're old, and they now more than ever are sensitive, and they would need somewhat of care. So these monies, it does then push people into that space of despair if you do find yourself in this kind of a situation and you don't have the funds to take the elderly to some of these homes.
No, without a doubt. So those prices would normally be for private healthcare. The public healthcare ones, the public facilities would be much cheaper, but still there's a cost. But whether people live in the private facilities or the public facilities, or even if they live at home, the law still is relevant in different degrees, but the principles remain intact. That the elderly have to have their safety protected. When abuse takes place, people have to report it. So when it's reported, it has to be investigated. And people whose safety is in jeopardy, the state has an obligation to put them in a place of safety, and again to make sure the assets and their property is safe throughout all these processes. So those remain applicable wherever a person might be located.
Yeah, no, it's something else. But just a reminder to our listeners at home that we're in conversation with Matthew Parks. You find us live on 0861 987 000. And yeah, we're talking about this bill that is now going to the president, the Older Persons Amendment Bill. So this bill would really see some of the legislation tweaked here, relaxed here, to ensure that the elders are taken care of. Do you sometimes, when you look at some of these issues that would be at the desk of the president, do you see, all of the processes having been explored, especially where this one is concerned? How progressive is the passing of this bill, according to you, Matthew? Do you think that, looking at the mammoth of these bills that are on the desk of the president, it will be prudent that he passes this as a matter of urgency?
So we think the bill is progressive. It's common sense. It's long overdue. And, laws are there to change the culture of society. So this is going to elevate the safety of the elderly. That's a good thing. It's going to help put in place standards upon which elderly must be taken care of. That's good. And it helps to kind of shift government resources to protect the elderly. That's also a good thing. And make sure they prioritize this amongst the many tasks. That's a positive thing. So look, now it's been passed by Parliament. Its next step is to be referred to the President for his assent. I don't see any issue why he would not assent to it. The President normally takes 3 to 6 months for his legal team to go through legislation from Parliament to make sure it's in line with the Constitution, both in terms of its content provisions, but also in terms of how it is processed by Parliament as well. But I would see no reason why he wouldn't sign it. I think it's a fairly straightforward, common sense, progressive bill. And so let's assume that he signs it around November or so this year. The Department of Social Development will then have to put in place promulgation dates for when will it come into effect. That often will be linked to budget issues about, have they got in place in the Department of Social Development resources to make sure it can be implemented and so forth. That may take, sometime in the first half of next year, because that links to the budget cycle too. That have they got money for the social workers, for the community health workers and the Department of Health and so forth. But one would assume they've thought that thing through because it is their bill. So I would assume it will come into effect by mid-half of next year, basically. I know this sounds like kind of long time as well. How would it take so long? But on average, it takes 5 years plus for legislation to be processed from a department to cabinet, to parliament, to NEDLAC, the president, and then implementation. It takes a bit of time. At times it can be frustrating, but also at times it takes a bit of time to also avoid making mistakes when you rush things. But nonetheless, it's a further step along the route, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. And how do we see this being implemented from here? Because, like I mentioned, there's the need now for some of those facilities to be built. We had the president talking about these plans to turn South Africa into a construction site. There are all of these plans that are in the pipeline, working with Infrastructure South Africa. Do we see this being something that maybe can be suggested as some of the projects that would follow, to say we need now more than ever to ensure that we ramp up the building of some of these facilities, so that we don't pass a bill and then it does then become somewhat of a flop? How do we actually ensure that this bill is seen through, looking at the fact that it does then speak to somewhat of a crisis?
Yeah. So look, it applies to all facilities do exist now. And there are facilities which do exist, so it applies to them. But also applies for people who take care of the elderly relatives at homes as well. But yes, hopefully it does help to nudge government too to begin to put more resource available to build old age care facilities, because there really is a shortage, especially for people with severe health needs. They're not enough by any stretch of imagination, not even a drop in the ocean. And also the issue, as you said earlier, the affordability as well. Most of the infrastructure projects, as far as I know, that are allocated are largely towards economic infrastructure. So that 1 trillion rand allocated over the next 3 years, about 400 billion rand is for roads. About 156 billion rand is for water. In fact, maybe slightly a lot larger than that actually. A lot is allocated to electricity, especially transmission lines. Quite a bit allocated to to freight rail, to ports, to passenger rail. Um, so mostly towards stuff which is going to help it unlock the economy, which is a positive thing too, because if you get to high economic growth rates, that enables companies to take off to sell their products and so forth. That helps to generate economic growth, and that helps them to bring additional tax revenue from companies, from income, and from personal tax as well into the state, and that enables the state to spend more on public services. So not unrelated. If the economy continues to grow along 1%, that means there's less tax coming to the state. That means all the many things you need to fund, from schools to universities, from hospitals to clinics, old age homes, to drug rehabilitation centers, which are also woefully far too few, to police, etc., to health and to community health workers, to social workers. It enables more funds to be allocated towards them as well. So, yeah, but this is, I think we need a broader discussion too, because I think ideally we want most elderly to live at home with their families, where they're able to, in terms of their health and so forth. But even then you need to have community health workers and also social workers who can go to communities to check if people are okay. Because often people live at home and the conditions are not great either. There is often abuse that takes place.
Yeah.
But if you have community health workers and social workers who can go throughout our communities and check out people, know where people live, know who's in which condition, who needs to have an eye kept out for them, that enables it, because often people just report issues when there's a crisis. So an elderly man is like immobile.
Yeah.
So you do want to have the city having a greater footprint. So in fact, our affiliate now has been actually going to court to make sure we actually prioritize community health workers, make sure they're permanent, they're part of the system, and actually that we see how to expand them, because their role in society, in particular elderly, is critical, because they are basically the hands and the feet, the eyes and the ears of the state to make sure that how the elderly are okay. And not just, as you're saying, in affluent areas where people have resources, but actually across the Cape Flats in our townships where people just don't have the resources.
Yeah.
And hence there's a real need to make sure the elderly can be taken care of and can retire in peace and comfort.
And also at the same time, I mean, when you look at it, there's a need now more than ever to ramp up the social worker drive with all of the social issues that are playing themselves out over the years. Matthew, I don't know if this is something that you would worry you as those that are in the labor space, that we don't actually get to see pronounced social workers, healthcare workers that are on the ground, that are walking the communities, that are would be the first line of call when there's an issue that is playing itself out. You hear even the schools themselves saying that at some point they used to have social workers, they used to have these inspections that would take place, but those have since faded. They're not happening anymore. You worry about the police, because they would tell you that most of them would be going on their day-to-day without somewhat of a social worker, a psychologist, someone that would constantly be there on their side to help them, to treat them, to debrief with them when they're coming from some of these deployments. So it does tell you that there's a need now more than ever to close some of these gaps, because socially there are all of these issues that are playing themselves out. Your gender-based violence. Now we're talking about the gogos that are really not taken care of here. There's a need then to really look at where things went wrong and where then we saw that switch. Matthew?
No, there is a need to do it, and we need to put resources into it, and to elevate the training and also the mindset, and also kind of really make this a bit of a priority. I think for far too long we've kind of viewed, and politicians, especially in the opposition, haven't helped. Treasury also hasn't helped, that we've been obsessed with the need to cut expenditure in the state. And yes, you must reduce the debt, you must manage the deficit and so forth. But at times you also need to look at the state as a tool to improve the life of society. And if you invest in the state, make sure it has resources, then the state can provide these goods that society depends upon. And yes, there's a bill to be paid today, but in the longer term, when you have a more caring society, a society where the rule of law can be applied, where people can live a decent life, that also helps to unlock the economy as well. So if we need to enforce the rule of law, then we need to have these social workers to make sure the kids, the elderly, the vulnerable are safe. We need to have these community health workers too, because it's far cheaper to pay for community health workers. You can go street to street. You can know who everybody lives in which community and know who's not well, and make sure people are taking the medication and so forth. That's a far cheaper thing to do, because the time otherwise you identify diseases, often it's too late. And the cost then is huge for the state, and often the cost also is huge for the individual, and the treatment might no longer be curable, manageable, or if it is, it's at a far greater cost. So we need to have a bit more of a proactive approach. But of course, equally to address society's frustrations, we must also make sure we deal with the issues of wastage in the state, of corruption, of wasteful expenditure, and so forth. And there is a lot of that. But again, a well-capacitated state can provide the goods of society, the economy depend upon.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And something that is always important, and it all flows from here, would be the budget, right? Would be the funding. I mean, when we don't have the boots on the ground, it always goes back to the issue of what is funded for, the austerity measures that we'll see playing themselves out. But now we are even talking about issues of infrastructure here. We saw a lot in the previous budget, that has been pushed into the economy, pushed into infrastructure. And we see the finance minister, actually, in actual fact, we'll see the National Assembly this week sit to debate the revised fiscal framework adopted by the Finance Committee last week. What can we expect where this is concerned, Matthew? There have been a lot of issues that have been playing themselves out. We saw the EFF taking even to the courts to challenge the issue of the fuel levy. Even you in the labor space, we've seen you talking about embracing issue with how then this is going to affect the ordinary workers when it eventually then plays itself out. What really then can we expect going into this process on Wednesday? Some of these issues as clear as day, or we can still expect a tussle in terms of this new fiscal framework?
We expect this one to go much smoother. On Wednesday last week, the two finance committees in the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces adopted the fiscal framework report. It will now go to the two houses to adopt. Of course, there's supplementary legislation too, which is part of the budget, like the Division of Revenue Bill, which allocates money to provincial local government, the Appropriation Bill, which allocates money to departments. There's the ESCOM debt bill, and there's another pension bill as well. So there's dates throughout the course of June and July for those to be processed, and we don't envisage any problems. Even in the finance committees, there was a clear majority representing the parties in government to adopt it, so we don't see any difficulties in that regard. The difficulty before is that the budget didn't have that support. But also, the court case by the EFF was dismissed on Wednesday. So I think from our side, it's largely expected to continue. Look, we need government to be able to pass the budget. The budget funds the salaries of teachers and nurses and police officers. It funds allocations to build hospitals and schools and clinics and roads and electricity and water. It also funds social grants for the elderly. It funds public employment programs for young unemployed persons. And so we need the budget to be put in place. There are things we're not happy with. So we're not happy that the fuel price freeze wasn't extended for another year. We're also not happy with the personal income tax bracket not being adjusted for inflation. But on the other hand, we are glad that we could, have the increase in VAT stopped. So there's a mixed bag. There's some positive allocation with additional doctors and nurses and teachers and police officers. There's additional allocations to begin to rebuild frontline departments like Home Affairs, Education, and Health. And there's reallocations to invest in infrastructure to help grow the economy. And there's allocations to help protect the poor. So for social grant recipients, 19 million of them, there's a double inflation increase, so 9.4% increase. Inflation last year was about 4.5%. Inflation is still falling further to about 3% now. So there are a variety of mechanisms. Not everything we would have wanted, but I think there's a mixed bag. There's some good things, there's some things we're not happy with, and there's some further discussion. But there is a need to have a broader discussion about, because the state under so much pressure and because society is dealing with so many crises, we need to have a discussion about what are the expenditure priorities that we all agree that must be put into the budget, what are the things we can actually live without, and also what are the acceptable revenue options to fund these and what are the unacceptable ones. I think we need to have a broader discussion, especially with the medium-term budget policy statement in Parliament in October, November, to have these discussions. Treasury should come to that MTBS in October, November, present a variety of options. The Parliament allow a much greater public debate. So by the time the Minister tables his budget speech, budget in February in Parliament, you already have a much greater sense of what society is willing to endorse, what society is not willing to endorse, so that you don't have what you had this year where Treasury tables a budget, assumes it's a fait accompli, and Parliament society rejects it, and then it's a crisis. So I think it's better to actually to shift the way Treasury has been doing these things for 31 years, where it could do so because there was a single ruling party under the ANC. But I think also the way it was doing it before, and Treasury itself would inform ministers and cabinet about the tax increases in the budget speech itself. That's not a good way to do stuff. You need to have a much more open discussion long beforehand, so the society has already given its signal about what it thinks it can and cannot live with. And those things should not be a question of secrecy. There should be nothing really secret about fuel tax, VAT, income tax, and so forth. There's actually no really confidential issues, but you do need to have a greater sense of ownership of where we're going, and also Treasury does need to be more responsive to society's frustrations.
There's just a lot, because one would look at the two rejections, right, coming through from the parliamentary processes. Hence, we see the 3.0 that would play itself out, and others saying even that we are in this unprecedented situation, because it does look like somewhat of a back-to-back now, looking at the fact that we do have the midterm budget policy statement that is also coming through in a couple of months. So how do we actually then separate these two processes? How do we see them playing themselves out at the same time? Really, how do we then not find ourselves back here again because of all of these issues that played themselves out? There were those, unprecedented issues that have played out for the first time in the history of South Africa, and one then wonders as to how do we move into the future in a way that we won't find somewhat of an instability coming through from the budgetary processes.
Yeah, and I think there's a need for everybody to shift a little bit. Treasury has been used to this being sort of their prerogative, and they can decide what happens. And they've been used to a Minister of Finance just being able to to tell cabinet colleagues, this is it, that's accepted, no discussion. So that's definitely, I think they've learned that lesson clearly, because they had to do this 3 times this year. It's a signal to cabinet too, they need to begin to take this thing much more seriously, and not just simply hand over their responsibilities to Treasury. I think it's been a signal to Parliament too that they need to be much more involved in this issue. Previously, Parliament just simply gone through the processes and, if in fact, just rubber stamped it. You don't have to go to extremes. You don't want Parliament to be drafting the budget itself, because it doesn't have the capacity to do it. These are, a lot of intricate numbers across multiple departments and entities, SOEs, municipalities. But you do need to have Treasury listening to the messages sent by Parliament, and you need Parliament to kind of be listening to the society at large. So that's a good thing. We think for ourselves is that don't let this opportunity go to waste. There's been a huge debate. Historically, often it's just a few organizations, individuals who make noise about this. There's been much greater debate. So that's a good thing. And I think for us it's about part of what the finance committee agreed to on Wednesday from our recommendations is that let's have these debates. Let's not stop it now. Let's continue to in the run-up to the medium-term budget policy statement. We hope as Cosatu to be meeting with the Finance Ministry, Treasury, to have this discussion about expenditure and revenue now that the budget's in the process of being passed by Parliament, and really to have Treasury come to Parliament in November to say, okay, here's a variety of options. You don't have to adopt all of them, but here are different options. Here are the pros and the cons. Here's what each can generate. People often assume that some tax revenue options can be the solution, and often you find that if there's a discussion with SARS and with Treasury, that actually those ones wouldn't generate the money you really do need. But also, you need to have Treasury being much more sensitive to what are the expenditure demands of society, what are the real priorities, because often they'll make incomprehensible mistakes. In this budget, they've given a good increase for social grant recipients, 9.4%, so double inflation. But they couldn't be bothered to give an increase for SAD grant recipients. And this is, out of the 5 years we had the SAD grant, and it benefits 8 million people, only 1 year has there been an inflation adjustment. And inflation adjustment this year would have been, relatively modest, 1.5 billion rand. So they could easily have accommodated within that increase, very, very easily. So you do need to have them being a little bit more sensitive to society. But there's been a good debate too. We pushed from our side as Cosatu to say, look, instead of looking at tax increase which would hit the poor, whether it's a VAT hike or PIT non-adjustment of brackets or a fuel tax hike, rather give the South African Revenue Service the money it requires to boost tax compliance from 64 to 70% over the next 2 years. Given the resources they need to actually make sure that they can make a dent in the 800 billion rand tax debtors book owed to the state. That's far better because that's taxes owed, and it doesn't make sense to squeeze those who pay their tax, who've got no obligation because they're teachers or they're nurses. Their tax comes off the payroll, so they're not going to duck it. It makes more sense not to squeeze them further when they're already drowning in debt, stuck in the cost of living. It makes more sense to go after that debtors book of 800 billion rand that for the society who doesn't pay. And often that's not an issue of poverty. Often people who owe money to SARS, it's very wealthy people who've got fancy accountants and tax lawyers and so forth, and no ways to duck the system. So it makes more sense to give SARS the resources it needs to employ accountants, lawyers, auditors, and so forth, invest in their IT capacity and so on. That makes much more sense. It's much more sustainable. Because if you only squeeze to the society and leave it untouched, it will create eventually a culture where society begins to ask, why are we paying tax and others are not forced to pay it? And you don't want to create that kind of a crisis. And I think that's the point that SARS made as well. So there is a positive move where the amount allocated to SARS over the next 3 years has been increased by an additional 4 billion rand, so it's about 7.5 billion rand. We'd really hope we can actually begin to shift it further up to about 20 billion rand, which is what SARS has been pushing for. But also, the minister did make a good point that tax hikes next year can be taken off the table if SARS is able to improve tax compliance. So that's a useful challenge to SARS to say, well, get us out of this crisis, and they can do it. They've got the capacity. They've improved tax compliance from 61 to 64% in the past couple of years. And under the Mandela and the Mbeki administration, the real success of those governments was under the late Pravin Gordhan, when he was commissioner for SARS, that he made into the engine room, which improved tax compliance significantly all the time. And that gave space to the government to invest more in public services and social relief, but also to give tax relief too as well, to invest more in this economy and stimulating and so forth. Do you want to get to kind of back to that kind of a momentum? So I think for us that's the more useful thing. But also we've been raising with Parliament too. Let's not just do this budget and then leave it to SARS and Treasury and see them in 6 months' time. There should be monthly report backs by SARS to say how far are they with regards to tax collections, so that when there are problems, government will be much more aware of it, Parliament will be much more aware of it. They also put pressure on SARS to do more, and when SARS needs additional support, they can also raise alarm. So we need to treat it as a kind of as an emergency like we treated COVID. We didn't just simply say to the Department of Health, good luck and tell us how it goes, but to be much more hands-on and supportive.
Yeah. I also wanted to check in around the issue of the fuel levy, because you get a lot of people saying that this is, even worse than tax. But how do we see that coming through to impact the consumers? And can we see then a little bit, because others would say with the issues of the oil price and what has been happening with the oil price doing well, then that could cushion us in terms of the impact of this fuel levy going forward. How do we actually find ourselves here? And could this then be a once off? Could we see something coming through maybe later on? Something that would change the dynamics in terms of how we approach the budgetary process? Can we expect to see it feature in the midterm budget policy statement in terms of how then we're moving forward with it? And with this then debate that we'll see playing itself out, I mean, how do we then see all of this then, speaking into some of the issues that have already been canvassed here? Because we see the National Assembly, they're expected to debate this revised fiscal framework. Could this debate come through maybe with a change in some of these issues, or they're as good as having been passed here, especially looking at the fuel levy? What is your understanding of how this one plays itself out?
Yeah, so the fuel levy will be increased. Parliament basically agreed to that. It's unfortunate, we didn't think it was necessary. The fuel levy, like VAT, it treats everybody the same. It does have an impact upon workers and commuters by making petrol a bit more expensive. It does have an impact upon inflation. But I think, what has helped cushion the blow a little bit now is that there was a decrease already penciled in because of the price of oil and the rand-dollar exchange rate, matters which are beyond our control as a country. So even though there's a fuel price increase of about, I think, 17 cents a litre, there was a larger decrease because of the oil price and the rand-dollar exchange rate. So actually, overall, we'll see a slight decrease in the fuel price, not as much as we would have hoped for. I think the decrease is about 7 cents a litre, something like that. So that's already, kind of come into effect from the first Wednesday of June. But look, I think beyond that, so to give credit to government, it hadn't increased the fuel price for 3 years. So that is, useful relief to the economy, to society, to commuters, to businesses, helped to reduce inflation. It's a difficult juggling act because you want expenditure, you also have to find what are the least painful revenue sources, and that's why we'd really focus on improving tax compliance in the SARS and not upon additional tax increases. But beyond that, we do need a discussion, and we've been, I think, almost the only ones reminding government and parliament that in 2018, the previous Minister of Energy made a commitment to review the fuel price regime. In 2022, the current Minister for Mineral Resources, Gwede Mantashe, made the same commitment. Government hasn't done that. We've been chasing them at NEDLAC to say, let's look at the fuel price taxes. There's about 5 or 6 fuel taxes and levies, which consume basically about a third of the fuel price. We think there is a need to see how can we begin to reduce it. Some of them you can't reduce it. Some of them you do want to keep in place. Some of them, for example, is a levy that helps to, part of an old agreement from about 30 years ago with the fuel industry, the garages, to keep the fuel attendants, petrol attendants employed. It's about 100,000 of them. You want to keep them employed, especially in the economy where you have such rampant levels of unemployment of 43%. But we think that overall there should be some space. One of the major issues that needs to be dealt with is the relaxing fund. It's funded by the fuel levy. It has about 400 billion rand worth of liabilities. It is a mess. It needs to be overhauled. There's real issues of incompetency, of corruption, of just chaos there. If you can sort the RAF, then you can begin to lessen its dependency upon the fuel levy hikes. So you need to kind of begin to kind of address some of these issues. But if you can reduce that, then you can ease the pressure. But also you need to have a broader shift towards public transport. So if we can get transport fully operational again, its capacity is about half of what it was in '94, yet the economy is double in size. Then you have to shield food from inflation. If you can get metro rail lines all reopened, and there is progress in that regard, it helps to provide commuters with a cheaper and much more faster form of public transport to get to work. Metro rail has lost about 90% of its customers since COVID, so its efforts to reopen lines and to ensure safety is critical. but again, helps to shield communities from inflation. But we need to shift towards public transport, so society is less exposed to the fuel price hikes, because there's not much we can do with the fuel price hikes. We import oil from overseas. When there's chaos in the Middle East, which is almost always there is some sort of chaos, it tends to spike things up. So the more we can do to shield ourselves as an economy and society from fuel, the better. And the ways you really do that is by having effective public transport. And again, we need to see how we can reduce this fuel price tax regime as well for the longer term.
Yeah, Matthew, I want us to leave it here for this morning. Let's just wait and see how all of these issues play themselves out. We're waiting to see if the president then moves to pass the Older Persons Amendment Bill, and hoping that it does then see all of these developments coming through to take care and help the elderly and vulnerable here. But indeed, all eyes will be on the National Assembly, where the debate of the revised fiscal framework, the budget, is concerned, going into this week. And yeah, if the sitting when the president was there is anything to go by, one can expect that it will be an interesting afternoon that would come out of Parliament, but we'll be keenly watching. Matthew, I want us to leave it here. I really appreciate you coming through and giving us your time.